I am Detective Samuel Reed. Our priceless necklace was stolen and I am here to uncover the truth. Miss Marple and the missing necklace.
Chapter 1. The Grand Celebration. The town of Rosewood was unlike any other place in the region. Nestled between rolling green hills and a sparkling river, it was a peaceful community where everyone seemed to know one another. The town was famous for its annual Heritage Gala, a celebration of its rich history and culture. Every year, people from neighbouring towns travelled to Rosewood to attend the event. This year's gala was especially important because it marked the 50th anniversary of the celebration. Weeks before the event, colourful banners were hung along the streets. Gardens were carefully trimmed, and shopkeepers decorated their windows with lights and flowers. Excitement filled the air as residents prepared for the grand occasion. At the centre of the celebration stood Hart Manor, the largest and most elegant mansion in Rosewood. Built over a century ago, the manor featured towering stone walls, beautiful stained glass windows, and a magnificent ballroom that could accommodate hundreds of guests. The owner of Hart Manor was Mrs. Eleanor Hart, respected philanthropist, who had spent much of her life supporting schools, libraries, and charitable organisations throughout the region. Although wealthy, she was known for her kindness and generosity. People admired her not only for her success, but also for her willingness to help others. This year, Mrs. Hart planned to unveil something special during the gala, a priceless diamond necklace that had belonged to her grandmother. The necklace was famous throughout Rosewood. It had been passed down through generations of the Hart family, and was considered one of the town's most treasured historical artifacts. The necklace contained dozens of brilliant diamonds arranged in delicate silver patterns. To its centre rested a large pear-shaped diamond that sparkled like a star. Few people had ever seen the necklace in person. Mrs. Hart usually kept it secured in a private vault. News that it would be displayed publicly for the first time in decades quickly spread throughout the town. On the evening of the gala, Hart Manor looked like something from a fairy tale. Hundreds of lights illuminated the mansion's exterior. Elegant carriages and luxury automobiles lined the driveway. Guests dressed in their finest suits and gowns arrived one after another, greeted by smiling staff members. Inside, ballroom glowed beneath enormous crystal chandeliers. A string orchestra played gentle music while servers moved gracefully through the crowd, carrying trays of refreshments. Near the centre of the ballroom stood a glass display case protected by advanced security equipment. Inside rested the famous necklace. People gathered around it throughout the evening. "It's even more beautiful than I imagined," whispered one guest. "Look at those diamonds," said another. "They must be worth a fortune." Mrs. Hart smiled as she listened to the compliments. Standing beside her was her nephew, Daniel Hart, a young man in his late 20s. Although polite and charming, Daniel appeared somewhat distracted. "You don't seem to be enjoying yourself," Mrs. Hart said. Daniel forced a smile. "I'm fine, Aunt Eleanor, just a little tired." Mrs. Hart looked at him carefully. "Are you sure? You seem worried about something." "It's nothing," Daniel replied quickly, before Mrs. Hart could ask another question. Several guests approached to congratulate her on the successful event. Among the attendees was Victor Lang, wealthy businessman known for his expensive tastes. Dressed in a perfectly tailored black coat, he admired the necklace for several minutes. "Remarkable craftsmanship," he commented. Mrs. Hart thanked him politely. Nearby stood Clara Benson, a respected jewellery dealer from the neighbouring city. She studied the necklace with professional interest. "If you ever decide to sell it," Clara said with a smile, "please let me know." Mrs. Hart laughed. "I'm afraid that won't happen. This necklace belongs to my family." Clara nodded. "I thought you might say that." Another guest, Professor Miles Crawford, a local historian, observed the necklace thoughtfully. "It truly belongs in a museum," he remarked. "Future generations should be able to appreciate its historical significance." "Perhaps someday," Mrs. Hart replied. "But for now, it remains with the family." As the evening continued, the ballroom became increasingly lively. Guests danced, shared stories, and enjoyed the music. The atmosphere was warm and cheerful. Yet beneath the celebration, several people carried private concerns. Daniel occasionally checked his phone and glanced nervously toward the entrance. Victor Lang spent long periods wandering through the mansion alone. Professor Miles seemed unusually interested in the security arrangements surrounding the necklace. Clara Benson appeared to be carefully observing everyone around her. None of these details attracted attention at the time. Shortly before midnight, Mrs. Hart stepped onto a small stage to address the guests. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, raising her glass, "thank you for joining us tonight. This celebration is not only about our town's history, but also about the friendships and community that make Rosewood such a wonderful place." Applause filled the room. "My grandmother often said that true treasures are not jewels or money, but the people we share our lives with. I hope tonight reminds us of that lesson." The audience applauded again. The orchestra began playing a lively piece, and many guests returned to the dance floor. Meanwhile, several staff members quietly monitored the necklace display. Security cameras watched every angle of the room. Motion sensors protected the glass case. Everything appeared perfectly secure. Midnight approached. Guests slowly began departing. Some offered final congratulations to Mrs. Hart before leaving. Others lingered to enjoy the last moments of the celebration. By 1 o'clock in the morning, the ballroom had nearly emptied. The necklace still rested safely inside its display case. At least that was what everyone believed. Mrs. Hart thanked her staff and retired to her room, exhausted but pleased with the success of the event. Outside, gentle breeze rustled through the rose garden surrounding the mansion. Clouds drifted across the moonlit sky. The manor gradually grew quiet. No one noticed a shadow moving briefly near the garden path. No one heard the faint sound of footsteps beyond the ballroom windows. And no one suspected that before sunrise, Rosewood's most valuable treasure would disappear without a trace. The grand celebration had ended. The mystery was about to begin. Chapter 2. A shocking discovery. The morning after the Heritage Gala dawned bright and clear over Rosewood. Golden sunlight streamed through the tall windows of Hart Manor, illuminating the elegant hallways that had been filled with music and laughter only a few hours earlier. Most of the staff were already awake, cleaning the ballroom and restoring the mansion to its usual order. Empty glasses were collected, decorations were carefully removed, and furniture was returned to its proper place. Mrs. Eleanor Hart woke later than usual. The previous evening's celebrations had left her exhausted, but she was pleased with how successfully the event had gone. Guests had enjoyed themselves, donations had been raised for local charities, and the necklace had attracted admiration from everyone who saw it. After breakfast, she decided to visit the ballroom one last time before the display was dismantled. As she walked down the grand staircase, she greeted several staff members. "Good morning, Mrs. Hart," said Martha, the housekeeper. "Good morning, Martha. I trust everything went smoothly overnight?" "Yes, ma'am. The clean-up is nearly finished." Mrs. Hart smiled and continued toward the ballroom. Room looked strangely different in daylight. Without the orchestra, dancing guests, and sparkling chandeliers, it seemed much quieter. Workers moved about, folding tables and removing decorations. Near the centre of the room stood the glass display case containing the necklace. At least, it should have contained the necklace. Mrs. Hart approached the case casually at first. Then she froze. Her heart skipped a beat. The case was empty. For a moment she simply stared, unable to believe what she was seeing. "No," she whispered. She stepped closer. The velvet cushion remained inside the display case, but the necklace itself was gone. Gone. A wave of panic swept through her. "Someone! Someone!" she shouted. Several staff members rushed over immediately. "What happened, ma'am?" asked Martha. "The necklace," Mrs. Hart cried. "It's gone." Everyone crowded around the display case. Gasps filled the room. Priceless family heirloom had vanished without explanation. Martha examined the glass carefully. "The case isn't broken. Can't simply disappear," another employee said. Mrs. Hart struggled to remain calm. "Call the police immediately." Within 20 minutes, officers from the Rosewood Police Department arrived at the manor. Leading them was Detective Samuel Reed, a highly respected investigator known for his patience and attention to detail. Detective Reed was in his early 40s, tall and composed, sharp grey eyes that rarely missed anything. As he entered the ballroom, he immediately studied the display case. "You discovered the theft this morning?" he asked. "Yes," Mrs. Hart replied. "When was the necklace last seen?" "At the end of the gala. It was still inside the case when the final guests left." Detective nodded thoughtfully. "Then our thief likely acted sometime during the event, or shortly afterward." He carefully examined the display case. Interestingly, there were no signs of damage. The lock remained intact. The glass was unbroken. Nothing appeared disturbed. "That's unusual," Reed said quietly. "What does it mean?" Mrs. Hart asked. "What?" "It means whoever took the necklace may have had access to the key." The possibility shocked everyone. "You think one of my guests stole it?" she asked. "It's too early to say, but we must consider every possibility." The detective requested the guest list. More than 100 people had attended the gala. Business owners, local officials, artists, teachers, historians, friends of the Hart family were all included. "It could be anyone," Martha said nervously. "Or no one," Reed replied. "We don't know enough yet." The detective began a detailed examination of the ballroom. He inspected windows, doors, locks, security equipment, and even the floor. Detail mattered. Several officers reviewed footage from the security cameras. To everyone's surprise, the recordings showed nothing suspicious. Guests moved throughout the ballroom normally. No one appeared to tamper with the display case. No alarms had sounded. No unauthorized entry had been detected. It was as though the necklace had vanished into thin air. By afternoon, Detective Reed gathered several key guests for questioning. The first was Victor Lang. Victor arrived looking confident and perfectly dressed as always. "Mr. Lang," said Reed, "where were you between 11 and midnight last night?" Victor frowned. "Mostly in the ballroom. Can anyone confirm that? Several people spoke with me throughout the evening." "Did you approach the necklace display?" "Everyone did." "Did you touch the case?" "No." Victor seemed cooperative, but the detective noticed he chose his words carefully. After Victor left, Clara Benson was interviewed. The jewelry dealer appeared genuinely shocked by the theft. "That necklace is famous," she said. "I understand you once offered to purchase it." "Yes, but years ago." "Were you disappointed when Mrs. Hart refused?" Clara smiled. "A little, not enough to steal it." The detective watched her expression closely. She remained calm throughout the conversation. Next came Professor Miles Crawford. The historian appeared concerned. "This is a terrible loss for Rosewood," he said. "You believe the necklace has historical significance?" "Absolutely. Did you ever have close access to it?" Miles hesitated briefly. "Only during academic research." The pause caught Reed's attention. Although brief, it seemed meaningful. Detective made a note. Finally, Daniel Hart entered. Unlike the others, Daniel appeared anxious. Dark circles rested beneath his eyes. "You seem tired," Reed observed. "I didn't sleep much." "Why not?" Daniel looked away. I was worried after hearing about the theft. The detective studied him carefully. Did you leave the ballroom during the gala? Why? To make phone calls. What kind of calls? Personal matters. His answers were truthful enough. But Reed sensed something was being withheld. Not necessarily guilt, but something. When the interviews ended, the detective reviewed his notes. Everyone had motives of some kind. Victor appreciated luxury and wealth. Clara worked in the jewelry business. Professor Miles valued historical artifacts. Daniel faced financial difficulties. Yet none of them could be directly connected to the crime. As evening approached, Detective Reed walked alone through Hart Manor. He replayed the events in his mind. A valuable necklace. Signs of forced entry. No damaged locks. No alarm activation. No obvious suspect. The case seemed impossible. Then something caught his attention. Near the display area, almost hidden beneath a decorative table, he noticed a tiny object reflecting the light. He bent down and picked it up. A silver button, small, elegant, expensive, definitely not part of the mansion's furnishings. Reed examined it carefully. The button looked as though it had broken off a high-quality coat, perhaps during a struggle. Or perhaps while someone moved hurriedly through the room. Either way, it was the first physical clue. For the first time that day, the detective felt a spark of optimism. The mystery was beginning to reveal itself. Someone had taken the necklace. Someone had left evidence behind. And sooner or later, Detective Samuel Reed intended to discover exactly who that person was. Darkness settled over Rosewood. Hart Manor stood silent once more. But inside its walls, an investigation had begun. The missing necklace had become the town's greatest mystery. And the search for the truth was only just beginning. Chapter 3. The Unusual Clue. The discovery of the silver button gave Detective Samuel Reed his first real lead in the investigation. For 2 days, theft of the necklace had dominated conversations throughout Rosewood. Every cafe, shop, and street corner buzzed with theories. Some believed an outsider had stolen the treasure. Others suspected one of the wealthy guests who had attended the gala. Meanwhile, Hart Manor remained under careful observation as Detective Reed continued searching for answers. On a rainy Tuesday morning, Reed sat in his office studying the silver button beneath a bright desk lamp. It was beautifully crafted. Unlike ordinary buttons, this one featured a detailed design engraved around its edges. The metal appeared expensive. Craftsmanship suggested it belonged to a custom-made garment. The detective turned the button over. There were no initials, no manufacturer's mark, no obvious clue revealing its owner. Yet Reed believed the button was important. People rarely dropped expensive items without noticing. Someone at the gala had lost it. The question was who? A knock sounded on his office door. Officer Jenkins entered carrying a folder. "We've finished reviewing the guest photographs from the gala," he said. "Anything useful?" Reed asked. "Possibly." Jenkins handed him several printed images. The photographs had been taken by the event photographer throughout the evening. Reed examined them carefully. Guests smiled for cameras, danced, chatted and admired the necklace. Then one photograph caught his attention. Victor Lang stood near the display case, wearing a dark black coat. The coat featured shiny silver buttons. Reed compared the image with the button found in the ballroom. The designs looked remarkably similar. "Interesting," Reed murmured. "That's what I thought," Jenkins replied. The detective studied additional photographs. Several showed Victor wearing the same coat, and in one later photograph a button appeared to be missing. Reed leaned back in his chair. At last, possible connection. Arrange another interview with Mr. Lang. Immediately. That afternoon, Victor Lang arrived at the police station. Unlike his previous visit, he appeared slightly annoyed. "I've already answered your questions," he said. You have, Reed agreed, but new information has emerged. The detective placed the silver button on the table. Victor's expression changed almost imperceptibly. Have you seen this before? Reed asked. Victor picked it up. It looks familiar. Perhaps because it resembles the buttons on your coat. Victor remained silent for a moment. Then he nodded. Yes, it does. Did this button come from your coat? Possibly. The detective watched him closely. When did you lose it? Victor shrugged. I couldn't say. You didn't notice? No. Reed slid a photograph across the table. It showed Victor earlier in the evening, with all buttons intact. Then he presented a second photograph. This one appeared to show a missing button. Victor examined both. Interesting, he admitted. Can you explain it? I suppose the button fell off during the gala. Near the display case containing the necklace. Victor frowned. That's merely coincidence. Perhaps. The businessman crossed his arms. Detective, are you accusing me of theft? No. Then why am I here? Because your button was found at the scene. Victor sighed heavily. I approached the display like everyone else. I admired the necklace. I spoke with guests nearby. If my button fell off, it happened accidentally. Did you remain in the ballroom all evening? Mostly. Mostly, Victor hesitated. I stepped outside briefly. Why? Fresh air. The answer seemed reasonable. Yet Reed sensed Victor was withholding details. Still, suspicion alone was not evidence. For another 20 minutes of questioning, Victor was allowed to leave. Once he departed, Officer Jenkins entered. What do you think? He asked. Reed stared thoughtfully at the photographs. I think Victor knows more than he's telling us. Do you think he stole the necklace? I'm not convinced. Why not? Because the evidence is too obvious. Jenkins looked puzzled. The button practically points directly to him. Exactly. The detective tapped the table. Criminals capable of stealing a priceless necklace without triggering alarms usually don't leave obvious clues behind. Jenkins considered this. So the button could be misleading? Possibly. The investigation continued. Later that week, Reed decided to revisit Hart Manor. He wanted to examine the ballroom again. Sometimes important details became visible only after repeated inspections. Mrs. Hart greeted him warmly. I hope you're making progress. A little. Have you identified the thief? Not yet. Her shoulders slumped. I was afraid you'd say that. Detective entered the ballroom and slowly walked around the display area. Everything remained exactly as before. The empty case stood in the center of the room, like a silent reminder of the crime. Reed carefully inspected nearby furniture, curtains, decorative plants. Then he noticed something unusual. A faint scratch marked the floor near the display case. We crouched for a closer look. And the mark appeared recent, almost as though something heavy had been dragged briefly across the polished wood. Caused this? He asked. Mrs. Hart looked surprised. I've never noticed it before. The detective followed the scratch several feet before it disappeared. Strange. It suggested movement. But movement of what? Certainly not the necklace itself. The clue raised more questions than answers. As evening approached, Reed walked through the mansion gardens. Rain clouds drifted overhead. The rose bushes swayed gently in the wind. While following a gravel path, he encountered the head gardener, an elderly man named Thomas. Good evening, detective. Good evening. Thomas hesitated. There's something I've been meaning to tell you. Reed stopped. What is it? The gardener glanced around nervously. On the night of the gala, I saw someone outside. The detective's attention sharpened immediately. Outside where? Near the garden path behind the ballroom. What time? Close to midnight. Who was it? Thomas frowned. I couldn't see clearly. Man or woman? A man, I think. Are you sure? No. The detective felt frustration rising. Any information could be valuable. Unfortunately, the gardener's memory offered few specifics. What was the person doing? Walking quickly? Carrying anything? Thomas thought for several moments. I believe so. What? I'm not certain, the detective sighed quietly. The information was incomplete, yet still important. Someone had been outside near the ballroom around the time of the theft. Fact could not be ignored. Darkness settled over Rosewood. Once again, Reed returned to his office. His desk was covered with notes, photographs, guest lists, interview records, and now the mysterious button. Despite days of investigation, the puzzle remained unsolved. Yet pieces were slowly coming together. Victor's missing button, the scratch near the display case, the figure seen in the garden. Each clue seemed connected somehow. The challenge was discovering how. Reed stared at the evidence board hanging on his wall. In the centre was a photograph of the missing necklace. Surrounding it were pictures of suspects and clues connected by red strings. The detective studied them carefully. One detail continued to trouble him. The theft itself had been executed almost perfectly. No broken locks, no alarms, no witnesses. Such precision suggested planning, careful planning, which meant the thief likely knew Hart Manor well, perhaps even better than anyone realized. Outside, thunder rumbled in the distance. Rain began tapping against the windows. Detective Samuel Reed closed his notebook and looked once more at the silver button. It had led him to Victor Lang. But deep down, he suspected the truth was still hidden somewhere else. And until he uncovered it, the mystery of the missing necklace would continue to haunt Rosewood. Chapter 4. Secrets Behind Smiles. A week had passed since the disappearance of the Hart family necklace. Rosewood remained captivated by the mystery. Newspapers carried daily updates. Local businesses discussed the case with customers. Rumours spread faster than facts. Yet despite Detective Samuel Reed's efforts, the necklace remained missing. Clues he had gathered seemed disconnected. The silver button pointed toward Victor Lang. A mysterious figure in the garden suggested someone had left the manor carrying something. The scratch marks near the display case hinted at movement. But none of these clues provided a clear answer. Reed had learned long ago that solving a mystery often required looking beyond evidence and examining people. People carried secrets, and secrets often revealed motives. One crisp autumn morning, Reed decided to revisit each major suspect, not to ask about the necklace directly, but to learn more about their lives. He began with Daniel Hart. Daniel lived in a small cottage on the edge of Rosewood, several miles from Hart Manor. Although he came from a wealthy family, he had chosen to live independently. When Reed arrived, Daniel appeared surprised. "Detective, may I come in?" Daniel hesitated briefly before opening the door. The cottage was tidy but modest. Books filled several shelves. A small fireplace crackled in the corner. Reed noticed stacks of unopened letters resting on a table. "You've received quite a bit of mail." "Proud." Daniel laughed nervously. "Nothing important." The detective sat down. "Daniel, I'd like to talk about something unrelated to the necklace." "All right, your financial situation." Daniel's expression immediately changed. "I don't see how that's relevant." "Perhaps it isn't. Humour me." For several moments, silence filled the room. Finally, Daniel sighed. "I've made mistakes." "What kind of mistakes?" "Investments." Reed listened carefully. The next half hour, Daniel explained that he had invested in several business ventures that failed. Although he wasn't bankrupt, he had accumulated considerable debt. "Does your aunt know?" "No." "Why not?" "I didn't want to disappoint her." The detective nodded thoughtfully. Financial pressure could certainly provide a motive for theft. Yet Daniel seemed genuinely ashamed rather than deceptive. Before leaving, Reed asked one final question. "Did you ever consider selling the necklace?" Daniel looked shocked. "Never. The answer came instantly, without hesitation. Reed believed him. The detective's next visit was to Clara Benson's jewellery gallery. The elegant shop occupied a corner building in the neighbouring city. Glass displays showcased rare gemstones and antique jewellery from around the world. Clara greeted him warmly. "Detective Reed, to what do I owe this pleasure? I have a few questions. I assumed you might." She offered him coffee before leading him into a private office. Unlike Daniel, Clara appeared perfectly relaxed. "Tell me," Reed began, "how much would the heart necklace be worth?" Clara smiled slightly. "As a piece of jewellery, or as a historical artefact?" "Both. Several $1,000,000. Figure was staggering." "That's quite a temptation." "It would be. Did you ever seriously try to buy it?" "Many times. And when Mrs. Hart refused, I respected her decision." The detective studied her face. Clara showed no sign of nervousness. Instead, she seemed amused by the questioning. "Detective," she said, "if I wanted that necklace, I would purchase it legally. Stealing it would destroy my reputation and my business." The argument made sense. Clara had spent years building trust with wealthy collectors and museums. A theft scandal would ruin everything. Still, Reed wasn't prepared to eliminate her from consideration entirely. As he prepared to leave, Clara added something unexpected. "May I offer a piece of advice?" "Of course." "Everyone is looking at money." "What do you mean?" "Sometimes people steal for reasons that have nothing to do with wealth." The detective paused. "What reasons?" Clara shrugged. Pride, fear, revenge, desperation. Her words lingered in Reed's mind long after he left. That afternoon, he arranged another meeting with Professor Miles Crawford. The historian welcomed him into a large house filled with books and antiques. Every room reflected Miles's passion for history. Ancient maps covered walls. Artifacts occupied display cabinets. Rare manuscripts filled shelves. Professor seemed pleased to discuss historical subjects. But, whenever conversation shifted toward the necklace, his enthusiasm faded. "Studied the heart necklace extensively," Reed observed. "Yes, perhaps more than anyone else." "I suppose so." The detective wandered toward a display cabinet. Inside rested several historical artifacts. Each item was carefully labelled. "You take preservation seriously." "History matters." "More than ownership." Miles adjusted his glasses. "What do you mean? If an artifact belongs in a museum but remains in private hands, does that bother you?" Professor considered the question. "Sometimes." "Did the heart necklace bother you?" A shadow crossed his face. It deserved wider appreciation. "That's not an answer." Miles sighed. "No, it did not bother me." Yet Reed sensed the response wasn't entirely truthful. For the first time, historian appeared uncomfortable. After leaving the house, the detective reviewed everything he had learned. Each suspect carried a secret. Daniel hid financial problems. Clara possessed an intense interest in the necklace. Professor Miles believed historical artifacts should be preserved for public viewing. Victor Lang remained unusually guarded about his movements during the gala. Everyone had something to hide. Yet none of those secrets directly connected them to the theft. That evening, Reed returned to Hart Manor. Mrs. Hart welcomed him into her study. The room overlooked the gardens where the mysterious figure had been seen. "You look troubled," she said. "Learned several things. Anything useful?" "Perhaps." Mrs. Hart poured tea. "Tell me." The detective summarized his recent interviews. When he mentioned Daniel's financial difficulties, Mrs. Hart looked saddened. "He should have told me. You weren't aware?" "No." "Pot." She stared into her teacup. "I would have helped him." The conversation continued for nearly an hour. Then Mrs. Hart remembered something. "Detective, there may be another detail." "What kind of detail?" "Several days before the gala, I overheard an argument." Reed immediately sat forward. "Between whom?" Professor Miles and Victor Lang. The detective's interest sharpened. What were they arguing about? I'm not certain. I only heard fragments. What fragments? Mrs. Hart thought carefully. I remember Victor saying, "You don't understand the consequences, Miles." He replied, "Some things are more important than consequences." Silence filled the study. The information was intriguing, very intriguing. Why didn't you mention this earlier? I didn't think it mattered. Might. As night settled over Rosewood, Detective Reed left the manor with more questions than ever. The suspects were becoming increasingly complicated. Relationships existed between them that had not been apparent before. Arguments, hidden concerns, private struggles. Each discovery seemed to uncover another layer of the mystery. Yet somewhere beneath all those layers lay the truth. The detective could feel himself getting closer. Someone at the gala had stolen the necklace. Someone had planned the crime carefully. Behind every polite smile and respectable reputation, secrets continued to hide in the shadows. Sooner or later, one of those secrets would expose the thief. Chapter 5. The Trail to the Garden. The investigation had entered its third week. Despite countless interviews, searches and theories, the Hart family necklace remained missing. Detective Samuel Reed was beginning to feel the pressure. The people of Rosewood expected answers, and Mrs. Eleanor Hart deserved to know what had happened to her priceless family heirloom. Yet every clue seemed to create more questions. The silver button connected to Victor Lang. Professor Miles appeared increasingly nervous. Whenever the necklace was discussed, Daniel Hart's financial troubles remained suspicious, and Clara Benson's comments about motives unrelated to money continued to linger in Reed's thoughts. One cloudy morning, Reed arrived at Hart Manor for another inspection. The mansion stood quietly beneath a grey sky. Autumn leaves drifted across the grounds, covering parts of the garden paths in shades of gold and orange. As he entered the property, he noticed Thomas, the head gardener, trimming rose bushes near the eastern side of the estate. Thomas waved. "Morning, detective." "Good morning." The gardener hesitated. "There might be something you should see." Reed immediately became interested. "What is it?" Thomas led him toward a less travelled section of the garden behind the ballroom. The area was bordered by tall hedges and winding stone pathways. "Cleaning here this morning," Thomas explained. "When I found something unusual," he pointed toward a large rose bush. Caught among several thorny branches was a small piece of dark fabric. Detective Reed carefully examined it. Fabric appeared expensive. Soft velvet, dark blue in colour, and recently torn. He carefully removed it from the bush and placed it into an evidence bag. "Was this here during the gala?" he asked. Thomas shook his head. "I don't know." The bushes were full of leaves then. Reed studied the area. The rose bush stood close to a narrow path leading away from the manor. If someone had passed through carrying an object, it would have been easy to snag clothing or fabric on the thorns. The detective looked around more carefully. The path continued toward a side gate near the edge of the property. Interesting. Very interesting. Back at the police station, Reed asked the forensic team to examine the velvet fragment. By the following afternoon, he received a report. The fabric did not come from clothing. Instead, it appeared to belong to a decorative carrying case, type commonly used to transport valuable jewellery. Reed stared at the report. For the first time, a clue directly connected to the necklace itself. If the fragment came from a jewellery case, then someone may have carried the stolen necklace through the garden. The discovery transformed the investigation. That evening, Reed called Officer Jenkins into his office. "What do you think?" Jenkins asked after reading the report. "I think our thief left through the garden." "That matches Thomas's story." "Exactly." The detective walked toward the evidence board. "We have a witness who saw someone outside near midnight." He pointed to a photograph. "Psst. Now we have physical evidence supporting that observation." Jenkins nodded. "So whoever stole the necklace took it outside?" "Most likely." "But why?" The detective considered the question. The thief had planned the crime carefully. Removing the necklace from the ballroom was only the first step. Real challenge would have been escaping with it. Perhaps the garden offered a route that avoided security cameras. Perhaps someone was waiting outside. The possibility troubled him. Could there have been an accomplice? The next day, Reed returned to Hart Manor and examined the garden path more thoroughly. With the help of several officers, he mapped the entire route from the ballroom to the side gate. The path wound through flower beds, trees, and decorative statues. At several points, thick hedges blocked visibility from the mansion. A person could move through the area almost unseen. As the search continued, one officer discovered something unusual near an old stone bench, a faint indentation in the soil, almost invisible. Reed crouched beside it. The mark resembled the impression left by a small case or box. It had long since been disturbed by weather, but its shape remained partially visible. Could the thief have stopped here? Perhaps hidden the necklace temporarily? The detective wasn't sure. Still, he carefully documented the finding. Later that afternoon, he visited Victor Lang again. Victor seemed less confident than during previous interviews. The growing attention surrounding the investigation was clearly affecting him. Reed presented the new evidence. Velvet fragment was discovered in the garden. Victor raised an eyebrow. "And it came from a jewellery-carrying case. I fail to see what that has to do with me." "Witnesses placed someone outside near midnight." Victor folded his arms. "Many people were outside that evening. Were you?" For several moments Victor remained silent. Finally he sighed. "Yes." The admission surprised Reed. "You were? Briefly." "Why didn't you mention that earlier?" "Because I knew how suspicious it would sound." "What were you doing?" Victor looked uncomfortable. "I received a phone call. Outside. I wanted privacy." The explanation sounded plausible. Yet Reed sensed there was more. "What time?" "Around midnight." The timing matched perfectly. Still, there was no evidence linking Victor directly to the theft, only circumstance. When Reed left, his frustration returned. Case remained maddeningly incomplete. That night, heavy rain swept across Rosewood. Detective Reed sat alone in his office, studying maps of Hart Manor. His eyes repeatedly returned to the garden route. Something about it bothered him. If the thief escaped through the garden, why leave a fragment of fabric behind? Professional criminals usually avoided such mistakes, unless fabric tear had been accidental or unexpected. Perhaps the thief had been moving quickly. Perhaps something had frightened them. Perhaps they hadn't planned to use the garden at all. The thought struck him suddenly. What if the garden route had been a last-minute decision? That possibility changed everything. Carefully planned theft would follow a carefully planned escape. A rushed escape suggested something had gone wrong. The detective immediately reviewed witness statements again. Hours passed. One report caught his attention. A staff member had mentioned hearing raised voices near the ballroom shortly before midnight. At the time, the comment seemed insignificant. Now it seemed important. Could someone have interrupted the thief? Could an argument have forced them to change plans? More Reed considered the idea, the more convincing it became. Post. The next morning he returned to Hart Manor with renewed determination. The garden was no longer simply a place where clues had been found. It had become part of the story. Somewhere along that winding path, the thief had carried the necklace. Somewhere among the hedges and rose bushes, a crucial event had occurred. And somewhere within those events lay the answer to the mystery. As Reed stood beside the rose bush where the velvet fragment had been discovered, He gazed toward the distant side gate. For the first time in weeks, he felt genuinely close to the truth. The trail through the garden was beginning to reveal itself, and if he followed it carefully enough, it might finally lead him to the missing necklace. Chapter 6. The Hidden Message. The investigation into the missing heart necklace had reached a critical stage. For weeks, Detective Samuel Reed had followed countless leads. The silver button, the garden trail, the velvet fragment, and the mysterious figure seen near midnight had all revealed pieces of the puzzle. Yet the most important question remained unanswered: who had stolen the necklace? As October drew to a close, the pressure on Reed increased. Newspapers questioned whether the case would ever be solved. Residents of Rosewood debated theories daily. Some believed Victor Lang was guilty. Others suspected Daniel Hart. Few even whispered about Professor Miles Crawford. The detective ignored the rumours. He trusted evidence. Pos. And evidence was finally beginning to reveal something important. One cold morning, Reed sat at his desk, reviewing photographs taken during the Heritage Gala. Hundreds of images had been captured that night, showed guests smiling, dancing, or admiring the necklace. For hours, he examined them carefully. Then one photograph caught his attention. It showed Daniel Hart standing near the display case. Nothing unusual at first glance, but Daniel appeared distracted, almost nervous. More importantly, another figure stood nearby. Clara Benson. The jewellery dealer seemed to be handing Daniel a small folded piece of paper. Reed leaned forward. The image was blurry, but the gesture was unmistakable. A note. Why would Clara secretly pass Daniel a note during the gala? The detective immediately contacted both individuals. Daniel arrived first. He appeared concerned when shown the photograph. "I remember that," he admitted. "You do?" "Yes. What was on the note?" Daniel hesitated. "I don't have it anymore." "Daniel," the young man sighed. "It wasn't important. Then why not tell me about it before?" For several moments, Daniel stared at the floor. Finally, he spoke. "Because I thought it would make me look suspicious." "What did the note say?" Daniel slowly reached into his jacket pocket. To Reed's surprise, he produced a folded piece of paper. "I kept it." The detective unfolded it carefully. Written in neat handwriting were the words, "Meet me near the fountain after midnight. I know the truth about the necklace." Reed read the message twice. Then a third time. His heart began to race. This was the most significant clue he had seen in days. "Who wrote this?" "I don't know. You received it from Clara Benson." "That's what I thought too." "What do you mean?" Daniel shook his head. "She handed it to me, but later she claimed someone else had asked her to deliver it." The detective's interest sharpened immediately. "Someone else?" "Yes." "Who?" "She wouldn't say." Silence filled the office. The note raised far more questions than it answered. "Did you go to the fountain?" Reed asked. "Yes." "What happened?" "Nothing." Daniel leaned back in his chair. "I arrived a little after midnight. The fountain area was empty." "No one came?" "No." "How long did you wait?" "About 20 minutes." "Then what?" "I returned to the manor." The detective studied him carefully. Daniel seemed truthful. If he was lying, he was remarkably convincing. After Daniel left, Reed arranged a meeting with Clara Benson. The jewellery dealer appeared genuinely surprised when shown the note. "I wondered whether it would ever become important," she admitted. "You delivered it?" "Yes." "Who gave it to you?" Clara hesitated. "I don't know. You don't know. A man approached me during the gala." "What man?" "Couldn't identify him." The answer sounded impossible. "You expect me to believe that? It's the truth." She crossed her arms. Ballroom was crowded. "Someone handed me the note and asked me to give it to Daniel." "Why didn't you ask questions?" "I assumed it was a personal matter." Reed frowned. "Can you describe him?" Clara thought carefully. "Tall." "Anything else?" "Dark suit." The description matched dozens of guests. Not helpful. Still, the existence of the note changed the investigation dramatically. Someone wanted Daniel at the fountain after midnight. Someone who claimed to know the truth about the necklace. Yet no one had appeared. Why? That question haunted Reed throughout the day. That evening, he visited Hart Manor once again. The fountain stood near the centre of the gardens, surrounded by stone benches and flower beds. Moonlight reflected off the water as Reed examined the area. He imagined Daniel arriving alone, waiting, watching, expecting a meeting that never occurred. Perhaps the writer of the note had changed their mind, or perhaps they had been prevented from coming. Possibility troubled him. As he walked around the fountain, something unusual caught his eye. One of the stone benches bore a faint scratch. Not a recent scratch, but something deeper, deliberate. Reed shined his flashlight closer. Several letters had been carved into the wood years earlier. Most were faded. One remained visible. The letter M. The detective stared at it thoughtfully. M. Miles. A coincidence, perhaps. Still, it added to his growing suspicion regarding Professor Miles Crawford. The historian had become increasingly nervous during recent interviews. His answers were careful. Too careful, and his argument with Victor Lang before the gala continued to bother Reed. The following morning, the detective reviewed another piece of evidence. Telephone records. Daniel had indeed been near the fountain around midnight. Mobile phone signal confirmed his location. More importantly, someone else's signal appeared nearby, a second phone. Active for only a few minutes, then gone. The owner remained unidentified, but the timing matched perfectly. Someone had been there, someone close enough to meet Daniel. Yet no meeting occurred. Why? The mystery deepened further when Officer Jenkins entered Reed's office carrying a folder. We found something. What, a witness? Reed immediately looked up. A witness to what? The fountain. The detective's pulse quickened. Jenkins opened the file. A maintenance worker was leaving the manor grounds shortly after midnight. And he saw a man standing near the fountain. Pause. Reed stood instantly. Did he identify him? No, the excitement faded slightly. What description did he provide? Jenkins consulted his notes. Middle-aged. Height? Average? Clothing? Dark overcoat. Again, frustratingly vague. Yet one detail stood out. The witness claims the man seemed frightened. Frightened? That's the word he used. Reed considered this carefully. Frightened man near the fountain. A mysterious note. A meeting that never happened. A missing necklace. Pieces were finally beginning to connect. Late that night, Detective Reed remained alone in his office. Rain tapped gently against the windows. The evidence board before him was now crowded with photographs, notes, timelines, and witness statements. His eyes moved from Daniel Hart to Clara Benson, from Victor Lang to Professor Miles Crawford, then to the photograph of the necklace itself. For weeks, he had focused on who might benefit from the theft. Now he realized a different question mattered more. Who feared the truth? The notes suggested someone knew something important. Important enough to arrange a secret meeting. Important enough to risk exposure. Perhaps important enough to frighten someone into silence. Reed slowly closed his notebook. He could feel the investigation approaching a turning point. The hidden message had revealed more than a clue. It had revealed a crack in the thief's carefully constructed plan. Soon, that crack would widen, and when it did, truth about the missing necklace would finally begin to emerge from the shadows. Chapter 7. The Real Thief. For nearly a month, the mystery of the missing necklace had puzzled the entire town of Rosewood. Every clue seemed to point in a different direction. Victor Lang's missing button suggested involvement. Daniel Hart's financial troubles created suspicion. Clara Benson's secret note raised questions. The mysterious figure in the garden remained unidentified. and Professor Miles Crawford's strange behaviour continued to trouble Detective Samuel Reed. Yet, despite all these clues, the necklace remained missing. On a chilly November morning, Reed sat alone in his office reviewing every piece of evidence one final time. The investigation board covered an entire wall. Photographs, witness statements, security reports, phone records, maps of Hart Manor. At the centre hung a picture of the necklace. The detective stared at it thoughtfully. For weeks, he had focused on finding the thief. Now he realised he should focus on understanding the crime. A theft always answered 3 questions: who, how, why. The answer to who remained uncertain, but the answer to how was becoming clear. The display case had not been forced open. The security system had not been triggered. No alarms had sounded. That meant the thief possessed knowledge of the security arrangements, possibly even access. Someone familiar with the necklace, someone trusted. Reed opened a folder containing appraisal records. Several months before the gala, the necklace had been professionally examined and insured. The appraiser's name appeared on every document. Professor Miles Crawford. The detective suddenly sat upright. A realization struck him. During the appraisal process, Miles had spent hours examining the necklace, hours studying its display mechanisms, hours handling the security arrangements. More importantly, he had likely been alone with the necklace at various points, long enough to copy a key. The possibility was startling. Reed immediately contacted Officer Jenkins. Within hours, they obtained records from the company that manufactured the display case. Results were revealing. Duplicate keys could be made only from precise measurements. Measurements that someone like Miles could easily obtain during an appraisal. The theory was beginning to make sense. Still, suspicion wasn't enough. Reed needed proof. That afternoon, he visited the insurance company responsible for evaluating the necklace. An employee provided additional records. As Reed reviewed them, another discovery emerged. Professor Miles had recently accumulated substantial debt, far more than anyone realized. Several investment losses had left him struggling financially. The amount owed exceeded hundreds of thousands of dollars. The detective frowned. This changed everything. Miles had both opportunity and motive. Yet, one question remained. Why had he repeatedly argued that the necklace belonged in a museum? The answer came unexpectedly later that evening. While reviewing correspondence connected to the appraisal, Reed found a letter written by Miles months earlier. The letter had been sent to a national museum. In it, Miles proposed an exhibition featuring the Hart necklace. The museum declined. Their response explained that they could not display privately owned artifacts without the owner's permission. Rejection appeared to have angered him. Suddenly, the puzzle pieces aligned. Miles genuinely believed the necklace belonged in public view. Financial desperation had transformed admiration into temptation. His motives were both ideological and personal, a dangerous combination. The next morning, Reed arranged a meeting at Hart Manor. Mrs. Hart, Daniel, Clara Benson, Victor Lang, Professor Miles, and several officers gathered in the study. The atmosphere was tense. Everyone sensed something important was about to happen. Detective Reed stood near the fireplace. "I believe this case is solved." Silence filled the room. Mrs. Hart looked hopeful. Victor appeared skeptical. Daniel seemed nervous. Professor Miles remained unusually quiet. Reed began slowly. The theft appeared impossible because no force was used. He looked around the room. The display case was open normally. "Meaning?" Mrs. Hart asked. The thief had a key. Professor Miles shifted slightly in his chair. The movement did not escape Reed's notice. The list of people with access to the necklace was very small. The detective walked toward the evidence table. For weeks, We followed several misleading clues. He picked up the silver button. This belonged to Victor Lang. Victor nodded. I told you that, and it had nothing to do with the theft. The businessman exhaled with relief. Reed continued. Daniel Hart's financial problems created suspicion. Daniel lowered his eyes. But debt alone does not make someone a thief. Detective then turned toward Clara. The secret note was real. Clara nodded, but it was unrelated to the theft itself. Everyone listened carefully. Finally, Reed faced Professor Miles. One person had both access and motive. Miles adjusted his glasses. Cannot be serious. I am. The room grew silent. You appraised the necklace. So, you studied its security. Naturally, you had access to the display case. Under supervision. Enough access to create a duplicate key. Miles stood abruptly. That's absurd, is it? Reed removed several documents from a folder. Your financial records tell a different story. A shadow crossed the professor's face. Those records are private. They became relevant when a priceless necklace disappeared. Mrs. Hart stared at him in disbelief. Miles? The historian avoided her gaze. The detective continued. You were deeply in debt. Silence. You knew exactly how valuable the necklace was. More silence. You copied the key during the appraisal. Professor Miles clenched his fists. No. You opened the display case during the gala. No. You placed the necklace into a velvet carrying case. Professor's expression changed. Only slightly, but enough. Reed saw it immediately. The velvet fragment found in the garden came from that case. Still no response. The witness near the fountain saw you. Miles looked away. And your argument with Victor Lang occurred because he suspected your growing obsession with the necklace. The room felt frozen. Finally, Mrs. Hart spoke. Tell me he's wrong. Miles closed his eyes. For several seconds, nobody moved. Then his shoulders slumped. A defeated sigh escaped him. Everyone understood. The truth had finally emerged. I never intended it to happen this way, he whispered. Mrs. Hart gasped softly. Victor stared in disbelief. Daniel remained speechless. Professor Miles slowly sat down. Years seemed to have aged him in moments. I admired that necklace for decades, he said quietly. No one appreciated its significance. You stole it, Reed replied. I know. Why? The professor looked toward the window. At first, I wanted to preserve it. His voice trembled. Then my debts grew worse. Silence filled the room. I convinced myself I deserved it. Mrs. Hart looked heartbroken. You were my friend. The words struck harder than any accusation. Miles lowered his head. I know. The confession was complete. Weeks of mystery had finally reached their conclusion. The respected historian, the trusted expert, the man who claimed to protect history, had stolen the necklace. But one question still remained unanswered. Where was it? Detective Reed folded his arms. Professor Miles, he said firmly, tell us where the necklace is hidden. The historian slowly raised his eyes. For the first time since the investigation began, everyone in the room was about to learn the final secret behind the missing necklace. Chapter 8. Justice and a New Beginning. The room was completely silent. Professor Miles Crawford sat motionless in his chair, surrounded by people who had once trusted and respected him. The confession had stunned everyone. For weeks, the town of Rosewood had searched for the thief responsible for stealing the priceless Hart family necklace. Now they finally knew the truth. The respected historian, who had spent years preserving the town's history, had become the very person who betrayed it. Detective Samuel Reed stood calmly near the fireplace. Professor Miles, he said, where is the necklace? The old historian stared at the floor for several moments. His face showed exhaustion rather than resistance. The burden of carrying the secret for so long had clearly taken its toll. Finally he spoke. It's hidden, Mrs. Eleanor Hart struggled to control her emotions. "Where?" she asked quietly. Miles looked at her with regret in his eyes. "I'm sorry, Eleanor." Disappointment seemed to hurt him more than the prospect of arrest. "You were my friend," she replied softly. Words filled the room with sadness. For years, Professor Miles had attended family gatherings, community events, charity functions at Hart Manor. He had been welcomed as a trusted guest. Trust had been shattered. Detective Reed waited patiently. "The location, Professor." Miles nodded slowly. Several miles outside town. He took a deep breath. Near the old railway storage building. Officer Jenkins immediately wrote down the information. The detective continued. "Is the necklace still there?" "Yes." "You haven't moved it?" "No." For the first time since the confession, relief appeared on Mrs. Hart's face. The necklace still existed. It hadn't been sold. It hadn't been dismantled. There was still hope. Within the hour, a police team accompanied Professor Miles to the location. The old railway storage building sat abandoned near the edge of Rosewood. Years earlier, trains had passed through the area regularly. Now, only rusted tracks and weathered structures remained. Rain clouds drifted overhead as the group approached. The building looked forgotten by time. Broken windows lined the walls. Weeds grew through cracks in the pavement. Miles led them toward a corner of the structure. There, he pointed toward an old wooden cabinet partially hidden behind machinery. Officer Jenkins carefully opened it. Inside sat a small blue velvet case, the same type of case, from which the torn fabric fragment had come. Everyone held their breath. Jenkins opened the case. A brilliant sparkle immediately filled the dim building. The Hart family necklace. Diamonds reflected light in every direction. After weeks of uncertainty, the missing treasure had finally been found. Mrs. Hart covered her mouth with emotion. Tears formed in her eyes. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Detective Reed carefully inspected the necklace. The thing appeared intact. Not a single diamond was missing. The family heirloom had survived its ordeal. For the first time in nearly a month, the mystery was truly over. Later that afternoon, Professor Miles was formally taken into custody. Before leaving, he requested a private conversation with Mrs. Hart. She agreed. The two sat alone in a quiet room at the manor. For several moments, neither spoke. Finally, Miles broke the silence. "I never intended to hurt you." Mrs. Hart looked at him sadly. "But you did." "I know. Why didn't you ask for help?" The question seemed to strike him deeply. He lowered his eyes. Pride. The answer was painfully simple. Years of financial troubles had isolated him. Fear of embarrassment had prevented him from seeking assistance. And eventually, desperation had clouded his judgment. "I convinced myself I had no choice," he admitted. "You always had a choice." Miles nodded. She was right. Theft had not been inevitable. It had been a decision. One he would regret for the rest of his life. When the conversation ended, Mrs. Hart quietly left the room. Although she had recovered the necklace, the loss of a friendship was something that could never be fully repaired. The following weeks, life in Rosewood slowly returned to normal. Newspaper headlines shifted to other topics. The rumours disappeared. People once again focused on their daily lives. Yet the story of the missing necklace became part of local history. Residents discussed it for years afterward. Not because of the value of the necklace, but because of the surprising identity of the thief. The lesson remained unforgettable. Appearances could be deceiving. Even respected individuals could make terrible mistakes. 1 month later, Hart Manor hosted a small community celebration. This time the event was far less extravagant than the Heritage Gala. There were no reporters, grand announcements. Only friends, neighbours and family members. Mrs. Hart wanted to thank everyone who had supported her during the difficult weeks. The necklace was displayed once again. However, several important changes had been made. A new security system protected the display. Additional cameras monitored every entrance. The case itself was constructed from reinforced glass. As guests admired the recovered treasure, Detective Reed stood quietly near the ballroom entrance. He preferred observing rather than participating in celebrations. Mrs. Hart approached him. "You never stopped looking." The detective smiled. "That's my job. You gave me back something priceless." "The necklace belongs here, Pa." She glanced toward the display. "The necklace isn't what I'm talking about." Reed looked surprised. Mrs. Hart smiled warmly, restored faith to this community. The detective wasn't sure how to respond. Instead, he simply nodded. Across the ballroom, Daniel Hart appeared happier than he had in months. With his aunt's support, he had begun resolving his financial difficulties. Victor Lang had returned to business ventures. Clara Benson continued operating her successful jewellery gallery. Life was moving forward. As the evening progressed, guests gathered around the display case. The necklace sparkled beneath the chandeliers just as it had during the original gala. Yet this time the atmosphere felt different. People appreciated it not merely for its beauty or value. They appreciated it because it represented perseverance, truth, and justice. Detective Reed stood quietly near a window overlooking the gardens. The same gardens where crucial clues had been discovered, the same paths that had hidden the thief's escape. Now they were peaceful once again. The mystery was solved, the necklace was home, justice had been served, and Rosewood could finally leave the past behind. As the celebration continued, Mrs. Hart raised a glass and smiled at her guests. For the first time in many weeks there was no fear, no uncertainty, only gratitude. Outside, the evening stars shone brightly over Rosewood, and beneath their gentle light, a new chapter of the town's history quietly began.
If you enjoy our story, then like and subscribe our channel. Thank you.